Okay, artists. So going back to observational drawing, let's jump in, still with the focus on drawing what we see and not what we prefer to see, still with the focus on trying to recognize and include as many values as we see in the object in front of us, because we don't want to round down. The fewer values we have, the flatter we leave it. So again, think about it as sculpting with light and shadow. The more values you have, the more clay you've got to build it up. So if we can include all the values you see, or as many as possible, we're giving our viewers more visual information to interpret this as three-dimensional, because of course, that's how we see the world around us. We know that things are three-dimensional purely because of light and shadow. So we want to include it here. So I've already drawn a light outline of a bottle I was looking at. It was a very tiny bottle that I now need to build up with value. I'm considering the light and dark values I see, where I see them, and then how I blend, because I also have to consider gradients now. So where do things not only get lighter and darker, but that transition between them, how abruptly do they get darker? How abruptly do they get lighter? Is it a smooth, gradual shift? Is it rather sudden and drastic, like a highlight? That's what gradient is. So I'm going in with a very light pencil, my lightest, having recognized the lightest value in this bottle's neck, and I'm starting to fill it in. Now I'm doing this with as consistent a pencil pressure as I can manage. Pressing not too hard, also not too softly. I want this to read, to stand out, so it's not too faint on the page. And I'm going to blend as I go too. It's easy to wait to blend to the very end, but then it's going to be harder for values to actually combine, for graphite to be smoothed out consistently across the page. Now you might see me avoiding little areas. I want to get a habit of not leaving large swaths of paper exposed, because I'm suggesting it's just air there, right? And that suggests there's no glass. Pure extreme white, like highlights, like a sheen off of glass or metal, well, they're about as equivalent as like the white I see when I look at the sun staring directly into it. That's rare. So I don't want to overuse it. I am going to blend into those areas, but you can see me moving around some areas where it gets really, really light, because I don't want to put too much value there. As I blur, I'm actually going to get some really light value smearing into them, probably like a 1 in the value scale. Now, every time I build up another layer of value in this study, it's going to get just a little darker each time. And right now I can probably use the same pencil in building it up, but I'm going to apply just a little more pressure with each pass. Okay. So what I'm going to do next is look for the next lightest value, just slightly darker, maybe a single square shift over on the value scale. If I ever get too dark, I can always pull back with an eraser. Okay, so let's see, where does it get darker in here? Looks like the edge of the bottle, directly below this upper lid here. So same pencil, a little more pressure. It's subtle, but then again, so is that value shift. I'm not seeing it get too much darker. Now, glass has a lot of value variation in it. And you can see why. Like sometimes you'll realize, oh, glass is clearly thicker in this area. And so light is playing off of it differently. It's harder for light to penetrate through it. It looks a little less transparent. In other areas, you might notice, wow, there's a really extreme highlight there. Or I can actually see, say, the bottom of the glass through the glass. I can actually see that like crushed circle, that oval, suggesting the base of the glass through that transparent body. If you see it, even if it's weird to draw, like absolutely draw it. Because if you see it, your viewer should too. It's part of the object. So right now, I'm noticing values get a little darker behind some of these highlights towards the top of this neck. And that's clearly the cork. I'm seeing part of the cork through there, and it's getting distorted, and its reading is just a slightly darker value. Now this is still really, really light overall, and I gotta keep building this up. But again, it's always easier to add than it is to subtract value. Because once you get too heavy-handed, it's a little harder to erase, right? So I'm trying to recognize and include as much value variation as I see. And that takes time. It can't be rushed. Maybe that means not just hammering this out in 15 minutes, but sitting down for an hour or 2 hours to keep building up. And maybe that also means like that's impractical. That's not time you have. You're juggling math and you're juggling science and other things like that. That's awesome. Way to juggle. Like tackling responsibilities, especially keeping that many balls in the air, is not always easy. But perhaps that means like you don't do it all at once. You've got your photographic reference. It's not going anywhere. The sun isn't going to move and change the lighting on that. It's going to be there for you if you sit down at 8 a.m. in the morning to revisit it, or if you revisit it at 10 p.m. So feel free to walk away, relax, take a breather, come back to it. Just don't rush. Put that time in because it's going to pay off. The more you draw the world around you, the more your understanding of how the world looks, be it human anatomy, like the logic of like our musculature or skeletons and how we move, say, the more sense lighting makes logically in your brain, the more you're going to be able to draw without reference. It takes a lot of practice in the meantime, though. But you get to a point where, gee, I want to draw some sort of like fantasy golem, like a living rock monster. Well, if you've been doing rock studies before, if you've drawn the texture of stones and the way light plays off that cracked surface and makes it look gritty, you could probably do that pretty convincingly from memory. You could suspend the disbelief of the people looking at it. It could look really dynamic. That knowledge wouldn't exist unless you studied still life. So now I'm going to build this up, and I realize it gets considerably darker in the lip of this glass. So I got to go in now, and it's going to start building up pretty quickly. It's going to be like a snowball rolling down a hillside, just gathering ice and slush and getting bigger. It's going to be gathering value. The more I push it, the more I need to recognize, like, okay, so where is that variation? Where does it get lighter? Where does it get darker? How dark is it? Is that an 8 on the value scale or is that a 10? It's not enough to just make it darker. Because if I get too dark too quickly, and then I notice I'm basically filling in anything that's dark, I'm just rounding to black. Well, then when I get like the darkest shadow being cast by my bottle, or say a 9 or 10 on the value scale deep within the thicker portion of the glass in the bottle, I don't have anywhere to go. I've already pushed it all the way to black. So I need to compare my values to one another as I draw. And this, far from being an outline, is actually some kind of distorted dark value I'm seeing in the bottle. Seems really intense, but I want to include it if I see it. So I want to draw what I see, how I see it here. Okay, so now I'm darkening what I think must be that cork. And I'm going to pause for a second here to do some blending before I get too far. I don't want to layer too much before I give myself an opportunity to do a little cleanup. As you can see too, there's a weird satisfaction building value up because you sort of get an object that emerges the more detail you recognize and capture. So while that can kind of be tedious, try to give yourself that challenge. Holding yourself to the idea of like, how much detail, how much value variation can I actually see and include in here? Because if you challenge yourself to try to push that value, find that detail, show us, say, maybe you did maybe 3 different values in your first sketch. Like I noticed where it was gray, I noticed where it was black, and I noticed where it was white. But not much in between there. It was probably a little flat. With each successive drawing then, hold yourself to a higher standard of like, I'm going to get 6 distinct values in this one, or 8. I'm going to recognize the entire value scale and build it up, because if you do, every object is slowly going to just build to more and more dimension. It'll almost pop off the paper. Okay, so let's take a break here for a second. It's starting to come together, but I gotta blend. The oils in my finger help with that. You can also use a smudge stick if you happen to have one, though I do prefer using a finger for this because I get a smoother blend. If you're a little clumsy with it, you smear outside of the image, well, no worries. We can always clean that edge up with an eraser later. Okay, so still trying to show value variation. Like, for example, this cork is definitely a very recognizable darker value than the glass around it. But then there's some, like, in here that are barely different from the value around it. And I want to capture that especially because those subtle, barely perceptible changes add to that realism. You notice them when you look at the glass bottle. A lot of artists might ignore them or round down and not include them, but if you include them, it's going to look that much more realistic. Okay. Now, normally, I would have filled the entire bottle with that lightest value first, but I just want to focus on the neck of this bottle for now, so I don't take up too much of your time, and you can kind of see the details emerge. So let's bump it up again. I was using an HB there. Now I'm going to use a 2B. And a little pressure. Try to push those darker values where I see them. Again, it can be really easy to just overdo it, to rush and to fill this whole thing in like a 9, an 8, a 10 on the value scale. But then it would just flatten out. So where am I noticing it's getting darker? Well, I'm definitely seeing a slight shadow cast underneath the lip here, which makes sense because it's almost like a canopy on a store or an entranceway. Light can't quite bend around that little roof. Look at the bottle there. So it's going to cast a slightly darker shadow. that I'm seeing some just unapologetically dark lines falling down. And I'm also noticing they bend with the curve of the glass, and that's important too. If they were straight up and down, it would flatten it, but I'm noticing these shapes that are distorted, that are curving alongside it. I want to make my values follow that same track because it's reinforcing the shape of that glass. The light is bending around it, so my value should bend with it too. It's all about making certain that I round up and not down. It would be easier to draw what I'd prefer and make it simpler for me, but I want to draw what I see. And if I don't let myself like off the hook like that, that's what's really going to sell this and make this look more realistic. Now, wow, my hand is starting to sweat a little, and I'm getting even better blending from it. That's great. Okay, let's visit. I notice it's a lot darker in here than my initial pass, so I've got to start pressing a little harder. Oh, and I don't know why I left this so bright on the very top there. I definitely see more value filling that in. There's a pretty sharp divide between the cork and that lip up there, so I can darken it without outlining it. Because of course we don't want an outline around this object, but there is a difference between dark values plastered right up against the silhouette of an object and just lazy outlining. Okay, I'm going to define this edge a bit more. I notice it does have some darker values in it, like right at the side. Okay, and next I'm gonna bump it up again. Let's see, let's grab a darker pencil and revisit for those darker portions in the bottle. I don't overdo it too much. Okay, not bad. I'm selling myself on this. And while I notice I've got a really dark, sharp transition from light to bam, darker right here, that's an abrupt gradient. Just below it, it gets dark, but it blends gradually downward like this for a smoother transition. Same as up here, I get this sort of gradient that goes light to dark very gradually. But then, moving left to right, I get these sort of like really sharp highlights that are like vertical, bending along the glass. And there's no smooth transition there. It doesn't go, oh, I'll just gradually turn into a lighter value. It's bam, it's just immediate. So I'm going to show that. And because I started blending into one value into the next up here, I can always revisit with my eraser and kind of pull those out. All right, same as here. Not bad. Now, when I step back, That's just one portion of my bottle, just that little neck. And I'm not totally done. I do think it gets darker in some areas. I'm gonna go back in. But I still have to do the cork. I have to do the body, which actually gets lighter overall, probably because the glass is thicker in the neck with so much glass doubled over itself for this lip. It gets a little lighter as it comes down, but definitely really smooth gradients from left to right. Like very gradual, and then very extreme dark shifts with those highlights and reflections in there. I want to capture all of it. So be certain that you're looking for value variation. How many different values do you see in there? In this case, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's just under 10 probably. If I recognize them, I want to include them, but I also want to blend as I go and avoid really heavy, very visible pencil lines because it's smooth glass and I do not want to make it look like it is woven out of wicker. All right? You got this.